How I've used Linux over the past 8 years might actually surprise a lot of people. Many users struggle when moving from Windows to Linux, and honestly, I completely understand why. I spent more than 20 years using Windows as a power user, and I even earned over 10 professional Windows certifications. So switching to Linux was definitely not easy for me. But after using Linux as my main operating system for the last 8 years, I've learned some really valuable lessons that might help advanced Windows users make the transition a lot smoother. One of the biggest things you need to understand is that problems will happen. A lot of Linux users like to say, Linux works on everything, and technically that's true, but that doesn't always mean the experience will be perfect. Hardware compatibility, software limitations, and configuration issues can still make things frustrating. Looking back at my first experiences with Linux, I documented almost everything. I tried Arch Linux for 10 days, Ubuntu for 30 days, Fedora, Manjaro, and many others. I was constantly distro hopping. People watching my channel would ask, what distro are you using now? Because it changed almost every week. But during all that experimentation, I realized something important. The Linux distribution itself usually doesn't matter as much as people think. What mattered more was understanding what I personally liked and disliked. A lot of beginners choose a distro based on appearance, and that mostly comes down to the desktop environment rather than the distro itself. Things like GNOME, KDE, and XFCE are desktop environments, not operating systems. Once I understood that, Linux started making a lot more sense. The cool part is that Linux lets you mix and match components however you want. You're not locked into one setup. For example, I use the Thunar file manager, which originally comes from XFCE, but I don't actually use the XFCE desktop environment itself. I simply liked the file manager and decided to keep it. That freedom to customize everything is one of Linux's greatest strengths. You can build your system around your preferences instead of being forced into one design philosophy. Another major mistake I made in the beginning was trying too hard to keep using Windows-only software inside Linux. I spent a lot of time experimenting with Wine and compatibility layers because many Linux users online claimed everything worked perfectly, but the reality is more complicated. If your work heavily depends on Microsoft Office or Adobe products, Linux can still be challenging. Those applications either don't work properly or require too much effort to maintain. For professionals who have spent years building workflows around Adobe or Office, Windows or Mac OS, may honestly be the better option. That doesn't mean Linux is useless though, and what worked best for me was dual booting and virtual machines. Many people think I mainly use Windows because they see me demonstrating Windows tools or software, but most of the time I'm actually running Linux underneath everything. Virtual machines especially became incredibly useful. Linux handles virtualization very well, and you can create highly optimized Windows virtual machines that feel almost native. Gaming was another huge area where Linux changed dramatically over the years. Back in 2018, Linux gaming was only beginning to improve. Valve had just started pushing Proton support on Steam. Compatibility was nowhere near where it is today. Games could run, but often required additional tweaks, launch commands, or custom fixes. Modding was especially difficult because most mods were built around Windows file structures and Windows tools. For example, I used to spend a lot of time playing heavily modded games and older MMOs. Final Fantasy XV was one of the biggest reasons I stayed tied to Windows for years. I used advanced modifications and external tools that interacted directly with the game client, and getting those working on Linux was a nightmare. The same thing happened with Age of Empires 4 because Linux users sometimes experienced multiplayer desync issues. Looking at my Steam statistics over the years really tells the story of my Linux journey. In 2023, only around 2% of my gaming happened directly on Linux. Most of my playtime was still on Windows, while a decent portion happened on the Steam Deck. Even though I was daily driving Linux at the time, gaming remained heavily Windows-focused because of mods and compatibility concerns. Then in 2024, surprisingly, my Windows usage for gaming actually increased further. I was still relying on Windows for games that required complicated modifications or specific launch tools. But by 2025, things completely changed. Almost 80% of my gaming time moved over to Linux. At that point, I had stopped playing Final Fantasy and Peen, and many of the games I enjoyed were fully supported through Proton and Steam. Today, Linux gaming is honestly impressive. If you mostly play games through Steam and don't rely heavily on anti-cheat systems or complex mods, Linux can feel almost plug and play. Proton DEB has become an incredible resource for checking compatibility before installing games. Of course, there are still exceptions. Some multiplayer games with kernel-level anti-cheat simply won't work. Mod-heavy games can also still be frustrating. But compared to where Linux gaming was 8 years ago, the improvement is massive. Another important phase of my Linux journey happened after the first year. At that point, I became obsessed with building the perfect Linux setup. I think this is something many Linux users go through. At first, I kept experimenting with desktop environments and distributions endlessly. Eventually, though, I simplified everything. These days, I mostly stick to the big Linux families like Arch, Fedora, or Debian. Instead of using full desktop environments, I switched to lightweight window managers. My current setup uses DWM, which is incredibly small and efficient. The actual binary that controls my graphical environment is tiny compared to traditional desktop environments. Why does this matter? Stability. A lot of Linux problems happen because users install too many extra packages, themes, extensions, and background utilities. Then a major system update happens, dependencies conflict, and suddenly something breaks. By simplifying my setup and only keeping the tools I truly need, my system became dramatically more reliable. In fact, my current Arch Linux system has been running for well over 600 days of uptime. Arch Linux is often considered unstable because it's rolling release, but for me it's been extremely dependable. I think the reason is simple. Less software means fewer things can break. Now I update my system whenever I want without worrying much. Years ago, skipping updates on Arch for months could cause serious issues, but modern Arch Linux has improved significantly. The maintainers have done an amazing job stabilizing the ecosystem. I also use some optimized kernel packages for desktop performance, but honestly, even standard Arch works very well today. One thing I absolutely love about Linux is how organized the operating system feels compared to Windows. Windows installations can become chaotic. Programs install files and program files, app data, registry entries, Microsoft Store directories, roaming profiles, and many other locations. Tracking configurations and cleaning things up can become confusing very quickly. Linux feels much cleaner. User-specific configurations are usually stored in the home directory under .config, while system-wide settings are mostly stored in, etc. There are exceptions, of course, but overall, Linux follows a far more standardized structure. Once you learn where things belong, troubleshooting becomes much easier. Dual booting also became an essential part of my workflow. I still recommend keeping Windows available for certain tasks. Some software simply works better there, and there's no shame in acknowledging that reality. If you decide to dual boot, I strongly recommend using separate drives whenever possible. Install Windows first, then Linux second. Keeping separate boot partitions helps avoid many headaches because Windows updates occasionally overwrite Linux bootloaders. Virtual machines are another area where Linux shines. I run Windows virtual machines regularly, and many people don't even realize they're virtualized because performance is so good. Linux handles hardware pass-through and virtualization extremely well. In some cases, gaming inside a Linux-hosted Windows VM can feel surprisingly smooth. Hardware choice also matters a lot in Linux. The AMD versus NVIDIA debate is very real. For gaming, AMD generally offers a smoother Linux experience because the drivers are built directly into the Linux kernel. You don't usually need to install anything extra. NVIDIA works too, but because it relies on external kernel modules, updates can occasionally create issues. That's one important thing new Linux users need to understand. Linux drivers are often part of the kernel itself. Most hardware support is already included when the operating system boots. Either your hardware works or it doesn't. That's very different from Windows, where you constantly install separate drivers manually. Display technologies have also improved significantly in Linux over the years. Back when I started, almost everything relied on Xorg. Configuring things like variable refresh rate, 4K scaling, or screen tearing required manual tweaking. Today, Wayland has become much more common, and many modern desktop environments support these features much better out of the box. Still, bleeding-edge hardware can be challenging. Linux support for brand new GPUs or CPUs often lags behind Windows and Mac OS initially because manufacturers prioritize those platforms first. Usually, after 6 months to a year, Linux support catches up and becomes excellent, but early adopters sometimes experience rough edges. At the end of the day, Linux can absolutely become the best computing experience you've ever had. It can be incredibly stable, lightweight, customizable, and efficient. But success with Linux depends heavily on understanding its strengths and limitations. If your hardware is well supported, your workflow matches Linux-friendly software, and you enjoy some level of customization, Linux can feel amazing. That's why some Linux users proudly talk about systems running for years without reboots or issues. For them, Linux is perfect. But your experience might be different depending on your software needs, hardware choices, and expectations. The important thing is approaching Linux realistically instead of expecting magic. For me, the journey from Windows Power User to Linux Daily Driver took years of experimentation, frustration, learning, and adjustment. But after 8 years, I can honestly say Linux has become my preferred operating system for most tasks.